Hi Year 10, Mr. Tapley here for your next lesson of Year 10 History in Semester 2. This lesson we're trying to do two things. We're trying to extend our knowledge of Kokoda, so the Kokoda campaign and the Pacific War, Australia and World War II. So we're trying to build off our knowledge from the previous lesson, trying to extend that. But we're also focusing on not just our knowledge, but our skills. So we're trying to develop our source analysis skills. So the ability to look at historical sources, information from the past, evidence from the past, and then using that information to develop our understanding of history. Success criteria is to complete a bit of research into the Kokoda campaign. I'll be giving you a few websites, a few sources that you can use, but it's up to you to inquire, to investigate those sources and find the information you need to complete the lesson activities on the Kokoda campaign in the Pacific War. And then you'll be assessing a couple of primary or secondary sources from this historical period. You guys have hopefully looked at source analysis in Year 7, Year 8, Year 9 history. But for those of you who are a bit forgetful, for those of you who need a bit of a revision course on source analysis, I thought this would be a good opportunity to do a bit of revision, to refresh our minds on what are primary and secondary sources. It's an important skill in history, being able to use these sources, and it is the main skill you will be using for the history CAT in week 6 or 7 we're looking at. So I thought it would be a good idea to read up on primary and secondary sources. So how do historians study and learn about information from the past? All our evidence for past history comes from primary sources. These are sources of information that were created in the time being investigated. So for example, if I'm studying ancient Rome in Year 7 history, the Colosseum is a primary source because that was created during ancient Rome. If I am studying feudal Japan, so Japan in the medieval times, if you will, looking at samurais and the ninjas and etc. If I'm looking at a samurai sword, that is a primary source because that was made way back in the many years ago where feudal Japan was. To study the past, you could use written sources such as letters, journals, newspapers, or art, or even photographs created in the past, so images. So I've got a little image on the bottom left there, which is from the Washington Times, which is a newspaper, and you can see they're talking about World War I finishing, so the end of World War I. So that is a primary source from World War I. There are also archaeological sources. So archaeology, basically digging stuff up from the ground. So you can find some cool weapons that I've got there, artifacts such as tools, weapons, jewelry, coins, even an entire city or a monument, such as the Great Wall of China, could act as a primary source because it was created during ancient China, during that time period, and it is a source of information that can tell us a bit about ancient Chinese history. So, the past isn't the only location to find information about history. Many historians, archaeologists, and scholars have studied primary sources to create secondary sources. Secondary sources are reconstructions of the past, so they're being created after the period of history being studied. So if I've got a GWC textbook that tells me a bit about ancient Greece, although it's talking about the past, it wasn't created during the past. It wasn't created in ancient Greece. It was created in 2020 and it's talking about the past. It's reconstructing, rebuilding, retelling the stories of ancient Greece. So it's a 2020 textbook. That's definitely a secondary source. Secondary sources can include books, websites, timelines are a good secondary source, or even documentary films, so videos. To create secondary sources, historians often identify information in primary sources, interpret the meaning of this information, and then use this to explain past history. So secondary sources are created by using primary sources, by looking at, for example, that newspaper headline. Looking at their primary source, you can create a secondary source which tells you about the media in World War I. It can tell you about the national morale, the feelings that was being felt during the time of World War I in that country. You can look at this sword here, this tool, knife, dagger, shovel, whatever it is, a primary source, and then you can create a secondary source that tells you about, well, what was this used for? When was it made? What is the material made of? Does it match up with other tools in the time period? So primary, hella old. Secondary, created after history, created afterwards. So you can use a film like Hercules, which is not 100% historically accurate, obviously, but it still gives you some information. The History Channel offers videos, documentaries, etc. about history. Those are secondary sources, and then your textbooks as well. So, historical sources can tell us about life, culture, and events of ancient civilizations. However, they do not explain themselves. So primary sources are super useful, but you need to actually investigate. You need to act as a detective to find the truth, to answer the questions about history. It is the role of a historian to interpret historical sources. The ancient samurai sword doesn't start talking to and being like, I was created here. It's not magical. You need to ask questions about where this artifact, where the source came from, when is it from, why was it created, who created it, what can you tell us about this period of history? So this lesson, I'm putting you guys in the role of the historian, of the detective, and you're going to be testing your source analysis skills by completing the Kokoda source analysis worksheet in Google Classroom assignments, and I'll show you where that is, walk you through it in a moment. But the general description, the learning test requires you to identify a series of historical sources. So I have 3 sources related to Kokoda in World War II. You need to, 1, label them as either primary or secondary, and you need to tell me why. You need to justify why you believe it is a primary source. You need to write a description about what this evidence can tell us about history. So what is this? What can it tell us? What is the meaning, the message of this, etc., etc. But I'll show you where that is in a moment. So if you go to Google Classroom, I apologize for my squeaky chair. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that. Go to Assignments, Sem2 Learning Task Kokoda, Source Analysis, and you'll get one of these cheeky Google Docs here. Again, this is your file. You don't need to create a new file. Only you and I can access your individual file. All you need to do is complete the questions and then submit it. Top right button, there should be a hand in button. And yeah, so that's the description of what you're doing. You can see I've got a few support resources there to help you complete this. You can also, of course, use the class slides. You can use your own notes that you've been taking in your digital notebook. And chapter 2 has information about Kokoda. You've got stuff on Kokoda specifically on page 86 and 87. We looked at that last lesson. But also in the pages beforehand, it tells you a bit about New Guinea. It tells you about the Pacific War, so what Japan got up to, bombing of Darwin. So all that information really can help you from page 82 onwards. So what you need to do, you can see I've got 1, 2, 3 sources of information, and the questions are similar, but you've got a few key differences. Anyway, so source 1 is actually a poem written by an Australian soldier fighting in Kokoda, World War II, 1942. So it's a written source of information. You need to tell me 1, is it a primary or secondary, and justify your response. 2, what can this historical source tell us about the Kokoda campaign? And I've given you a few prompts, a few discussion points, so maybe you'll talk about what the environment was like in Kokoda, the terrain, where they actually were fighting. What were the soldiers' experiences like? Did they have a lot of morale? Were they happy, thumbs up, or were they sad? What were some of the challenges they faced in Kokoda? And then question 3, you'll see that this is actually a poem called The Crossing of the Owen Stanley Range, or it was from the book, The Crossing of the Owen Stanley Range. So this source references that mountain range. I would like you to complete some independent research to tell me what it is, where it is, and how this connects to the Kokoda campaign. Why have I included it in our little Kokoda source analysis? Where is that, and how does it relate to Kokoda? So that's source 1. Source 2, it's probably my favorite of the 3. You've got like a little kangaroo with an Australian army hat. He's got a gun. He's got a little Australian soldier in his pouch. He's got the cricket paraphernalia back, and you can see the outline of Northeast Australia. You'll have to zoom in to see what's happening there, but that says New Guinea, so it's obviously Papua New Guinea. You've got a Japanese soldier kind of staring at him, facing off. So it's a little political cartoon depicting Australia versus Japan in the Pacific War conflict from 1942. So again, question 1, is it primary or secondary? Justify response. Question 2, what is the main message of this source? So what is it trying to tell you? Consider the audience for this political cartoon and the context of when this is, what is happening, etc. So what is the main message? Couple sentences. And then question 3, Before invading New Guinea, Japan had conquered a number of different countries in the Pacific War. Complete some independent research to identify these countries, plural. There's more than one. So this one's asking you to do a bit of background research. So you're looking at the Pacific War in general. We know that Singapore obviously fell before Kokoda, so you could write in one of those there. But Japan actually went through the Pacific region and just kind of conquered a whole bunch of countries. So you're writing down a list of countries that Japan conquered or invaded or defeated in World War II in the Pacific War. Then question 3, that's where this information, not so much on Kokoda, but the Pacific War in general, will be super helpful for you. Question 3. So I've got a written text source, I've got a visual source, and now we have a video as well. So this is a video summarizing the Kokoda campaign and the significance of this conflict to Australia in 2017. We've actually, well, I've included this one in the slides. I don't know if you've watched it, but it's a little behind the news video from a couple of years ago. So 3 minutes long, watch the video and then answer these questions. Question 1, is this a primary or secondary source? Justify your response. This one's a bit tricky because there's a few primary sources in there. There's footage from the 1940s, but you have to think about, is this actually a primary source? Was it created during the time period, or is it a reconstruction of the past? Question 2, what can this historical source tell us about the Kokoda campaign? So that's the same as you got in question 2 for source 1, but I'm after some new information. So what's new in this video that you weren't told in the first 2 sources we looked at? So what's some new information about Kokoda that you've learned by watching this video? Question 3, no wrong answer. This one's more of a summary question. Which of these 3 sources was most valuable to improving your understanding of the Kokoda campaign? Justify your response, so explain why. So no wrong answers, just your opinion about which of those 3 sources was easiest for you to understand, which one offered the most information or the most important information. Whew, and I'm out of breath. That's all we've got time for, guys. I should have the due date listed here. Well, it's scheduled to appear on Friday. The due date is our next lesson, which is Wednesday. It is a bit much for one lesson, I recognize that, except for some of you who are on the ball, but you guys kind of got off the hook early this week. You had 2 lessons of history, so this is me catching up on some of the work. I don't want to give it to you every lesson, obviously, but since we missed out on 2 lessons worth of work by losing the Thursday double to parent-teacher interviews, we need to catch up a little bit. So you do have the weekend to work on it, and you've got until Wednesday to smash it out, and I'm hoping that you can complete most of it, or most of you can complete most of it, during this first lesson. But if you have any questions about it, please let me know, of course. Otherwise, best of luck, guys, and I hope you're well, and cheers.